Margaret Chin pulled her modest sedan into the circular driveway of the Westbrook estate, the gravel crunching beneath her worn tires. The imposing mansion loomed before her, its Georgian columns and manicured gardens a stark reminder of the world she had never quite belonged to, despite sharing the same bloodline as its inhabitants. She gathered her simple canvas bag from the passenger seat, the same bag she had carried to visit her father every week for the past 3 years. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves as she approached the grand entrance. Before you continue with this story, I'm curious to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who understands what it feels like to be overlooked by family? Or perhaps you've witnessed similar dynamics in wealthy families around your area. Leave a comment below about where you're tuning in from and whether family money has ever created divisions you've observed. Inside the marble foyer, voices echoed from the mahogany-paneled study. Margaret recognized the confident baritone of her older brother Richard and the sharp, calculated tones of her younger sister Victoria. She paused at the doorway, observing the scene that had become painfully familiar over recent months. Richard stood behind their father's massive oak desk, his tailored Armani suit impeccable as always. His manicured hands gestured expansively as he spoke into his phone, discussing quarterly projections and market acquisitions with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. At 38, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent and competitors nervous. Victoria lounged in the leather wingback chair, her designer heels propped carelessly on a priceless Persian rug. Her platinum blonde hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she scrolled through her phone, occasionally showing Richard images of what Margaret could only assume were expensive purchases. The diamond tennis bracelet on Victoria's wrist probably cost more than Margaret's annual teaching salary. Neither acknowledged Margaret's presence as she quietly entered the room. Their father, Harrison Westbrook, sat in his wheelchair near the window, his once powerful frame now frail and diminished. The man who had built a shipping empire from nothing, who had commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, now struggled to hold his coffee cup steady. His steel-gray eyes, though clouded with fatigue, still held flickers of the sharp intelligence that had made him a fortune. Margaret approached her father with the gentle care she had learned during her years as an elementary school teacher. She adjusted the blanket across his legs and checked that his medications were within reach, small gestures that had become as natural as breathing. Harrison's eyes brightened slightly when he saw her. His weathered hand reached for hers with the tremulous movement of age and illness. Margaret squeezed gently, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins that marked the passage of time. Richard ended his phone call and turned toward the room with the air of someone about to make an important announcement. His voice carried the same commanding tone he used in corporate presentations, confident and unwavering. The family business requires decisive leadership during this transition period, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the room without truly seeing Margaret. The board has expressed concerns about continuity, and I've assured them that Westbrook Industries will maintain its competitive edge under new management. Victoria looked up from her phone, her perfectly applied makeup highlighting features that bore a striking resemblance to their late mother. Her voice held the entitled edge that had characterized her since childhood, when she had learned that charm and beauty could open doors and wallets with equal effectiveness. The estate planning attorney called again this morning, she said, examining her freshly manicured nails. I told him we need to expedite the process. The mansion alone requires significant updates, and I've already consulted with several interior designers about modernization plans. Margaret continued her quiet ministrations to their father, straightening the stack of books on his side table and ensuring his water glass was full. She had witnessed countless conversations like this over the past months, discussions that treated their father's impending death as little more than a business transaction to be managed efficiently. Richard moved to the window, his silhouette impressive against the backdrop of the estate's sprawling grounds. His voice took on the tone of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. The transition timeline needs to be accelerated, he continued. I've scheduled meetings with our major clients for next week to discuss the leadership change. The board expects seamless continuity, and I intend to deliver exactly that. Victoria rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone who had attended finishing school and cotillion classes. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved to examine the collection of rare first editions that lined the study's walls. These books alone are worth a fortune, she mused, running her finger along the leather spines. The auction house estimated the entire collection at well over $2 million. Of course, I'll need to make space for more contemporary pieces that better reflect my aesthetic preferences. Margaret felt her father's grip tighten slightly on her hand. She glanced down to see him watching his other children with an expression that seemed to combine sadness with something that might have been disappointment. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, meant only for Margaret's ears. "They speak as though I'm already gone," he murmured, his words carrying the weight of a man confronting his own mortality while witnessing his children's naked ambition. Margaret leaned closer, her voice equally soft but filled with the warmth that had made her beloved by her students and their parents. She possessed the rare gift of making others feel heard and valued, a quality that seemed to have skipped her siblings entirely. "You're still here, Dad," she whispered back. "Your presence still matters, regardless of what they choose to see." The study door opened to admit Mrs. Patterson, the longtime housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years. Her dignified bearing and silver hair gave her an air of quiet authority that even Richard and Victoria respected, though Margaret suspected their deference had more to do with Mrs. Patterson's intimate knowledge of family secrets than genuine regard. "Mr. Westbrook," she said in her crisp British accent, "your attorney, Mr. Fitzgerald, has called again regarding the document review. He emphasizes the importance of a private consultation at your earliest convenience." Richard immediately stepped forward, his corporate instincts engaging automatically. His voice carried the presumptuous authority of someone who had spent years making decisions for others without seeking their input. "I'll handle the legal coordination," he announced. "Schedule the meeting for tomorrow morning. I want our estate planning team present to ensure all aspects are properly addressed." Victoria looked up from her examination of a Ming vase, her interest clearly piqued by any discussion involving legal documents and potential inheritance. Her voice held the calculating tone of someone always seeking advantage. "The attorney mentioned updated documentation," she added. "I assume this involves the trust fund distributions and property allocations we discussed. The sooner we finalize everything, the better for all concerned parties." Mrs. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested discomfort with the siblings' presumptuous attitudes. The housekeeper had been present for every important family moment, had witnessed the gradual erosion of respect and genuine affection. "Actually," Mrs. Patterson replied with careful precision, "Mr. Fitzgerald specifically requested a private meeting with Mr. Westbrook alone." He was quite emphatic about the confidential nature of the discussion. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle sign of displeasure that Margaret recognized from childhood. He had never handled being excluded from important decisions, had always assumed his position as eldest son granted him automatic inclusion in all family matters. "I'm sure he'll appreciate having family representation present," Richard said, his tone suggesting the matter was settled despite the lawyer's explicit request for privacy. Victoria moved closer to their father's wheelchair, her voice taking on the honeyed tone she employed when seeking something valuable. Her smile was perfect and completely devoid of genuine warmth. "Daddy," she said, using the childhood endearment she had abandoned years ago except when seeking financial favors, "we just want to ensure your wishes are properly documented. The legal complexities require careful navigation, and Richard has such excellent relationships with the finest estate planning specialists." Margaret watched her father's face during this exchange, noting the way his expression grew increasingly distant. She had spent enough time with him to recognize the signs of his growing fatigue, both physical and emotional. The constant pressure from his other children, their transparent eagerness for his death, had taken a visible toll on his already fragile health. Harrison closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, his gaze found Margaret's. In that moment, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat, a flash of the shrewd intelligence that had built an empire, combined with something that looked almost like conspiracy. "Margaret will accompany me to any legal meetings," he said quietly, his voice carrying unexpected firmness despite its physical frailty. She understands my preferences better than anyone." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through several expressions before settling on barely controlled irritation. Victoria's perfect composure cracked just enough to reveal genuine shock beneath her carefully maintained exterior. Margaret felt the weight of their combined stares, the familiar sensation of being judged and found wanting by siblings who had never bothered to look beneath the surface. She had grown accustomed to their dismissive attitudes, their assumption that her quiet nature indicated weakness or irrelevance. But in her father's eyes, she saw something different entirely: recognition, respect, and perhaps most surprising of all, trust. The following morning brought an unseasonable chill to the Westbrook estate, as if the very air recognized the growing tension within its walls. Margaret arrived to find the circular driveway crowded with expensive vehicles, each one representing another family member who had suddenly developed intense concern for Harrison's well-being. Dr. Reynolds emerged from the study, his expression grave as he spoke quietly with Richard near the marble staircase. The family physician had been making increasingly frequent visits, each one marking another step in Harrison's decline. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation as she passed, medical terms delivered in the hushed tones reserved for discussing the inevitable. Richard nodded solemnly at whatever the doctor shared, but Margaret noticed how quickly his expression shifted to calculation once Dr. Reynolds departed. Her brother immediately pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen as he typed what appeared to be urgent messages. "The business partnerships we've been cultivating need immediate activation," Richard said into his phone, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed his future was already secured. "Schedule the acquisition meetings for next week. I want everything positioned for a seamless transition." Victoria swept down the grand staircase like a queen descending to hold court, her silk blouse and designer slacks perfectly coordinated with jewelry that sparkled under the chandelier's light. She carried fabric samples and what appeared to be architectural plans, her arms full of materials that suggested extensive renovation schemes. "The interior design team will be here at 2, she announced to no one in particular, spreading her materials across the antique mahogany dining table without regard for its priceless finish. "The east wing requires complete modernization, and I've identified several walls that can be removed to create more contemporary flow." Margaret watched in quiet dismay as her sister treated their father's beloved home like a renovation project rather than a family legacy. Every room held memories. Every piece of furniture had been carefully selected over decades of building a life and career. Uncle Charles arrived with his wife Eleanor, their faces arranged in expressions of appropriate concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. Margaret had always found her father's younger brother to be calculating, someone who had spent his entire life in Harrison's shadow while secretly resenting his brother's success. Charles embraced Richard with the hearty affection of someone cementing an alliance, his voice booming across the foyer with forced cheerfulness. "The shipping contracts in Singapore are ready for renewal," he said, clapping Richard on the shoulder. "I've maintained those relationships specifically for this transition period." Eleanor air-kissed Victoria with the practiced precision of someone who had attended countless society functions. Her voice carried the refined accent of old money, though Margaret knew her aunt had married into wealth rather than inheriting it. "The charity board positions will need to be redistributed," Eleanor said, examining the mansion's artwork with appraising eyes. "I've already spoken with several organizations about stepping into more prominent roles once the family dynamics are properly reorganized." Margaret slipped past these conversations and made her way to her father's room, where she found him staring out the window at the gardens he had lovingly designed and maintained for 40 years. His breakfast sat untouched on the bedside table, and she noticed the tremor in his hands had become more pronounced. "They arrive like clockwork," Harrison said without turning from the window. "Each decline in my health brings fresh faces, renewed concern, and increasingly transparent motivations." Margaret settled into the chair beside his bed, the same chair where she had read to him countless evenings over the past months. Her presence seemed to calm him in ways that medical interventions could not. Cousin Marcus burst through the front door with his usual lack of subtlety, his voice echoing through the mansion as he called out greetings to anyone within hearing range. Margaret had always found her father's nephew to be exhausting, someone who compensated for his lack of business acumen with excessive enthusiasm and misplaced confidence. "Uncle Harrison," Marcus shouted as he bounded up the stairs, "I've been thinking about the European shipping routes and how we can optimize the profit margins once I take over the operational oversight." Margaret felt her father's hand tighten on hers as they listened to the presumptuous planning taking place throughout the house. Every conversation seemed to revolve around division of assets, assumption of control, and redistribution of wealth that had taken a lifetime to accumulate. Richard's voice carried from the study as he held what sounded like a business conference call. "The quarterly projections justify immediate expansion," he was saying, his tone suggesting decisions already made. "The board will ratify the leadership transition once the legal formalities are completed." Victoria's laughter rang out from the dining room, where she was apparently entertaining the interior design team. "The current aesthetic is hopelessly outdated," Margaret heard her say. "We need something that reflects contemporary sophistication rather than this museum-like atmosphere." Margaret rose quietly and moved to close her father's door, muffling the sounds of the family circus that had taken over his home. When she returned to her chair, she found him watching her with an expression that seemed almost amused despite the gravity of their situation. "They assume so much," Harrison said, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent for weeks. 40 years of building an empire, of making careful decisions and strategic plans, and they believe it all transfers automatically through biological accident. The afternoon brought Mr. Fitzgerald, the family attorney, who arrived with his briefcase and the serious demeanor of someone handling matters of enormous financial consequence. Margaret watched from the upper landing as Richard and Victoria immediately flanked the lawyer, their body language suggesting they viewed him as their ally rather than their father's representative. "We've prepared comprehensive transition documents," Richard said, guiding Mr. Fitzgerald toward the study with proprietary confidence. "The corporate structure requires immediate clarification to ensure market stability." Victoria linked her arm through the lawyer's other elbow, her smile dazzling as she deployed her considerable charm. "The estate planning components need coordination with the charitable foundations," she added. "I've already begun preliminary discussions with several nonprofit organizations." Mr. Fitzgerald politely but firmly extracted himself from their escort, his voice carrying professional courtesy tinged with subtle resistance. "I appreciate your concern, but my appointment is specifically with your father. The matters we need to discuss require his direct input and authorization." Margaret saw the flash of annoyance that crossed both siblings' faces, the barely concealed frustration of people accustomed to getting their way through persistence and presumption. They had spent their entire lives believing that charm and entitlement could overcome any obstacle. Later that evening, after the various relatives had departed and the house had finally quieted, Margaret found herself alone with Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen. The longtime housekeeper was preparing Harrison's evening medications, her movements precise and caring. "They speak as though he's already gone," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, echoing Harrison's earlier observation. 40 years I've worked in this house, watched this family grow and change, and I've never seen such eagerness for someone's passing." Margaret helped arrange the pills in their designated compartments, a routine they had established to ensure Harrison received proper care despite the family chaos swirling around him. She had learned more about medical management in the past months than she had ever expected to need. The phone rang constantly throughout the day, Mrs. Patterson continued, each caller asking about Mr. Westbrook's condition with the transparent hope of hearing news of decline. The business associates, the social contacts, even the household staff from other estates, all fishing for information they can use to their advantage. Margaret carried the medication tray upstairs, passing the study where Richard was still on the phone with what sounded like international business partners. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed his future was not only secure, but imminent. "The Asian market's present immediate opportunities," he was saying. "Once the transition is formalized, we can move aggressively on the shipping lane acquisitions. The timing couldn't be more advantageous for expansion." In her father's room, Margaret found him still awake despite the late hour, his eyes alert and focused in a way that reminded her of the formidable businessman he had been. When she handed him his evening medications, he gripped her wrist gently but firmly. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying quiet determination. "We meet with Mr. Fitzgerald. Just the two of us, as originally planned. There are things that need to be discussed, documents that require attention, and decisions that cannot be delayed any longer." Margaret nodded, sensing the weight of whatever her father needed to share. Outside his room, the mansion had finally fallen quiet, but she could feel the anticipation hanging in the air like fog, the collective breath-holding of people waiting for change they believed would benefit them immeasurably. The call came at 3 in the morning, piercing the silence of Margaret's modest apartment with the sharp urgency that accompanies life's most profound moments. Mrs. Patterson's voice, though steady and professional as always, carried an unmistakable weight of finality. "You should come now, Miss Margaret," the housekeeper said simply. "Your father is asking for you." Margaret drove through the empty streets with a mixture of dread and purpose, the familiar route to the estate taking on new significance in the pre-dawn darkness. The mansion's windows glowed softly against the night sky, and she knew that inside, the most important chapter of her father's remarkable life was drawing to its close. She found Harrison propped up in his bed, his breathing labored, but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had defined him. Dr. Reynolds stood nearby with Richard and Victoria, their faces grave as they received updates on their father's condition. The doctor's words were clinical but kind, preparing them for what everyone could see approaching. Richard immediately took charge of the room's dynamics, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he employed in crisis management situations. His corporate training had taught him to view even personal tragedy as a problem requiring systematic solutions and decisive leadership. "We need to notify the board immediately," he said, already reaching for his phone. "The succession plan requires immediate implementation to prevent market instability. I'll convene an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Victoria stood at the foot of the bed, her usual confidence somewhat shaken by the reality of watching their father's decline. Yet even in this moment of impending loss, Margaret could see her sister's mind working, calculating the implications and opportunities that would emerge from their father's passing. "The funeral arrangements need to reflect the family's standing in the community," Victoria said, her voice maintaining its usual precision despite the circumstances. "I've already researched the most appropriate venues and services. We'll want something that honors his business legacy while positioning the family for continued prominence." Margaret moved quietly to her father's side, taking his frail hand in hers with the gentle care that had characterized their relationship. In contrast to her siblings' immediate focus on practical matters, she simply sat with him, offering the comfort of presence over the urgency of planning. Harrison's eyes found hers, and in that gaze she saw not fear, but something that resembled peace mixed with determination. His voice, though weak, carried the clarity of someone who had made important decisions and found satisfaction in their completion. "The meeting with Mr. Fitzgerald yesterday," he whispered, meant only for her ears. "Everything is properly arranged now. You understand what needs to be done." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain what her father meant. Their private consultation with the attorney had been brief and somewhat mysterious, with documents signed and instructions given that she hadn't fully comprehended at the time. The hours that followed blurred together in the strange, suspended animation that accompanies deathbed vigils. Family members arrived in waves, their faces arranged in expressions of appropriate sorrow that couldn't quite conceal their underlying anticipation of what would come next. Uncle Charles paced the hallway outside Harrison's room, his phone pressed constantly to his ear as he conducted urgent business calls that seemed designed to position himself advantageously for the upcoming transition. His voice carried the hushed excitement of someone who saw opportunity in tragedy. "The Singapore contracts expire next month," Charles said into his phone. "We need to ensure continuity of leadership to maintain those relationships. I've been Harrison's partner in those negotiations for 15 years. Cousin Marcus arrived with his wife Sandra, both of them carrying themselves with the solemnity befitting the occasion while their eyes assessed the mansion's contents with obvious calculation. Margaret overheard fragments of their whispered conversations about property values and asset distribution. Eleanor swept through the house like a general surveying territory, her trained eye cataloging artwork and antiques while maintaining the facade of grief-stricken concern. She spoke in hushed tones with Victoria about social obligations and community standing, their conversation revealing priorities that had little to do with mourning a beloved patriarch. As the afternoon sun slanted through the mansion's tall windows, Harrison's breathing became increasingly shallow. Margaret remained at his bedside while the others gathered in the study, their voices rising and falling in discussions about business continuity and estate management. Richard's voice dominated these conversations, his confidence absolute as he outlined his vision for the company's future direction. He spoke with the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to inherit not just wealth, but power and position. "The board has full confidence in my leadership capabilities," he announced to the assembled relatives. "The transition will be seamless, and I intend to expand the business into markets that Harrison was too conservative to pursue." Victoria coordinated funeral arrangements with military precision, her phone calls to florists and caterers interspersed with consultations about the mansion's immediate needs. She spoke about their father as though he were already gone, her planning extending well beyond burial services into estate management and social positioning. Mrs. Patterson moved through the house like a ghost, attending to Harrison's needs while the family conducted what amounted to business meetings in every other room. The housekeeper's loyalty to the dying patriarch was absolute, her disapproval of the family's behavior evident only in subtle gestures and carefully neutral expressions. As evening approached, Dr. Reynolds made his final assessment and quietly informed the family that Harrison had only hours remaining. The announcement triggered immediate action from Richard and Victoria, who began making phone calls to attorneys, accountants, and business associates. "The legal team needs to be on standby for tomorrow," Richard said, his organizational instincts engaging automatically. "We'll want immediate access to all estate documents and corporate transition protocols." Victoria coordinated with the funeral home and began reaching out to social contacts who would expect notification of Harrison's passing. Her approach to grief was methodical and strategic, designed to maintain family prestige while managing public perception. Margaret remained beside her father as the mansion filled with the controlled chaos of people preparing for a future they believed they understood completely. None of them seemed to notice the small smile that played at the corners of Harrison's lips, or the way his eyes tracked to the safe behind his desk where important documents waited. At 10:37 that evening, Harrison Westbrook drew his final breath with Margaret holding his hand and whispering words of love and gratitude. The man who had built an empire from nothing, who had commanded respect across 3 continents, who had raised 3 children with vastly different values, passed peacefully into whatever comes next. The silence that followed lasted exactly 37 seconds before Richard began making phone calls to set the succession plan in motion. Victoria immediately started coordinating with the funeral director and social secretary. The mansion transformed from a place of death into a headquarters for managing the complex logistics of wealth transfer. Only Margaret remained beside her father's body, honoring the man rather than racing toward the fortune he had left behind. In the growing darkness outside his bedroom window, she could see the gardens he had loved, the legacy of beauty and careful cultivation that would outlast all their scheming. The law offices of Fitzgerald, Morrison and Associates occupied 3 floors of downtown's most prestigious building, their mahogany-paneled conference room designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. 1 week after Harrison's funeral, the Westbrook family gathered for what they assumed would be the formal confirmation of their anticipated inheritance. Richard arrived first, his custom-tailored black suit reflecting both appropriate mourning attire and the confidence of someone expecting to receive control of a shipping empire. He carried a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be transition documents, his preparation evident in every calculated gesture and expression. Victoria swept into the conference room like royalty granting an audience, her designer dress and pearls suggesting wealth that would soon be officially hers. She had spent the morning at the country club, accepting condolences from social contacts while subtly positioning herself as the new matriarch of one of the city's most prominent families. Uncle Charles and Eleanor arrived together, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn respect that barely concealed their excitement about potential inheritance. Charles had spent the week reaching out to business contacts, positioning himself as a key advisor for the family's continued success in international shipping. Cousin Marcus bounded through the door with his usual lack of subtlety, his voice booming across the conference room as he greeted everyone with inappropriate cheerfulness. His wife Sandra followed behind, her eyes immediately assessing the office's expensive appointments and obvious prosperity. Margaret entered quietly, carrying only a simple purse and wearing the same modest black dress she had worn to the funeral. Her siblings barely acknowledged her presence, their attention focused entirely on Mr. Fitzgerald as he arranged documents on the conference table with methodical precision. The attorney commanded respect despite his unassuming appearance, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the air of someone who had spent decades handling matters of enormous consequence. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of legal expertise combined with genuine compassion for families navigating loss. "Thank you all for gathering today," Mr. Fitzgerald began, his tone appropriately grave. "As you know, we're here to review Harrison Westbrook's last will and testament, a document that reflects his careful consideration of family needs and business continuity." Richard leaned forward slightly, his corporate instincts engaging as he prepared to assume the leadership role he had anticipated his entire adult life. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this meeting. "I've prepared transition documents for the business operations," Richard said, sliding his portfolio across the table toward the attorney. "The board expects immediate clarity about succession, and I want to ensure seamless continuity of leadership." Victoria smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose expensive lifestyle was about to receive official validation and unlimited funding. Her voice held the honeyed tone she employed when expecting to receive something valuable. "I've already begun preliminary discussions with interior designers and social coordinators," she added. "The family's community standing requires careful management during this transition period, and I'm prepared to assume those responsibilities immediately." Mr. Fitzgerald nodded politely, but made no move to examine Richard's documents. Instead, he opened a thick leather folder and began extracting papers that bore the official seals and signatures of legal documentation. "Before we begin," the attorney said, "I want to acknowledge the complexity of estate planning for someone of Harrison's stature and business acumen. He spent considerable time ensuring his wishes were clearly documented and legally binding." Charles shifted in his chair, his anticipation barely contained as he envisioned the business partnerships and opportunities that would flow from his association with the Westbrook fortune. His voice carried the eager tone of someone positioning for advantage. "The international shipping contracts require immediate attention," Charles said. "Harrison and I developed those relationships together, and I'm prepared to assume full responsibility for maintaining those crucial business connections." Eleanor adjusted her jewelry with the satisfied air of someone expecting to inherit not just wealth, but social position. Her voice carried the refined accent she had cultivated through decades of upper-class social climbing. "The charitable foundation boards will need new leadership," Eleanor added. "I've maintained relationships with all the appropriate organizations, and several have already expressed interest in expanded partnerships under new family management." Margaret sat quietly at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap as she watched the performance unfolding before her. She had learned to recognize the particular brand of confidence that came from people who had never experienced genuine consequences for their assumptions. Mr. Fitzgerald cleared his throat and began reading from the document, his voice taking on the formal cadence required for legal proceedings. The initial language was standard, establishing Harrison's identity and legal capacity to create binding documentation. "I, Harrison Edward Westbrook, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," the attorney read. "I revoke all previous wills and codicils, and direct that this document shall govern the distribution of my estate." The family leaned forward collectively, their attention focused with laser intensity on every word. Richard's jaw was set with determination, Victoria's smile remained perfectly in place, and the extended relatives arranged themselves like an audience expecting an entertaining performance. "To my son Richard," Mr. Fitzgerald continued, "I leave my collection of rare wines, valued at approximately $50,000, in recognition of his appreciation for fine vintages and his sophisticated palate. Richard's expression flickered slightly, confusion replacing confidence as he processed a bequest far smaller than anticipated. Victoria's smile faltered momentarily before returning to full strength, her mind clearly calculating that smaller gifts to others meant larger inheritances for herself. To my daughter Victoria, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection, including all pieces acquired during our marriage, valued at approximately $200,000. These items represent family history and should remain within the bloodline. Victoria's smile became strained as she realized that her inheritance, while valuable, fell far short of the millions she had expected. The jewelry collection was beautiful, but hardly represented the vast wealth she had planned to inherit and deploy. To my brother Charles, I leave the vintage Rolls-Royce in my collection of nautical antiques, in appreciation for his lifelong interest in maritime history and classic automobiles. Charles's face went pale as the reality of his modest inheritance began to sink in. Eleanor gripped his arm, her own expression shifting from anticipation to barely concealed panic as she realized their financial expectations were not materializing. To my nephew Marcus, I leave my collection of first edition books, with the hope that they will inspire the same love of learning that has guided my own life decisions. Marcus's usual exuberance evaporated completely, replaced by the stunned silence of someone whose assumptions had just been systematically demolished. His wife Sandra looked ready to flee the room entirely. The family exchanged glances of growing alarm, their comfortable assumptions crumbling with each modest bequest. Richard's portfolio of transition documents suddenly seemed presumptuous and foolish. Victoria's renovation plans appeared premature and embarrassingly inappropriate. Mr. Fitzgerald paused in his reading, his eyes scanning the room to gauge the family's reaction to these preliminary distributions. Margaret noticed that the attorney's expression remained carefully neutral, giving no indication of what portions of the will remained to be read. The silence in the conference room grew thick with tension and dawning realization. The Westbrook family fortune, the shipping empire, the mansion, the international business interests, all the wealth they had counted on inheriting, had not yet been mentioned in the will's provisions. The conference room's silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of growing disbelief. Richard's face had progressed from confusion to alarm as the reality of his modest wine collection inheritance settled into his consciousness. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table, her jewelry bequest suddenly feeling like an insulting consolation prize rather than a family treasure. Mr. Fitzgerald continued reading the remaining minor bequests to household staff and distant relatives, each one a small but meaningful gesture that spoke to Harrison's attention to detail and genuine care for people who had served him faithfully over the years. Mrs. Patterson received a generous pension and lifetime residence in the estate's guest cottage, bringing tears to her eyes as she sat quietly in the corner. Uncle Charles appeared to be experiencing some form of shock, his face alternating between red and pale as he struggled to process the gap between his expectations and reality. Eleanor had gone completely silent, her usual social chatter replaced by the stunned paralysis of someone watching their financial future evaporate in real time. Cousin Marcus looked as though he might be physically ill, his usual boisterous confidence replaced by the queasy realization that his anticipated windfall had been reduced to a collection of books, however valuable they might be to scholars and collectors. Margaret remained composed throughout these revelations, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she observed her family's growing distress. Something in her father's final conversations had prepared her for this moment, though she hadn't fully understood his cryptic comments about proper arrangements and necessary preparations. Mr. Fitzgerald reached what appeared to be the end of the document, his voice maintaining professional neutrality despite the obvious tension radiating from his clients. The final paragraphs seemed to address administrative details and executor responsibilities, standard language for estate management and legal compliance. Richard finally found his voice, though it carried a strained quality that betrayed his growing panic about the business empire he had expected to inherit. His corporate training had not prepared him for a scenario where his fundamental assumptions proved completely wrong. Mr. Fitzgerald, Richard said, his voice carefully controlled, there seems to be some oversight regarding the primary estate assets. The business holdings, The mansion, the investment portfolios, these items haven't been addressed in the documentation you've read. Victoria leaned forward, her composure cracking enough to reveal the desperation beneath her polished exterior. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence and charm, qualities that seemed suddenly inadequate for the current situation. Surely there's additional documentation, she added, her tone suggesting that the attorney had simply misplaced crucial pages. The shipping company alone is worth hundreds of millions. There must be separate trust documents or corporate succession plans that govern those assets. Mr. Fitzgerald closed the leather folder with deliberate precision, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite what must have been his anticipation of this exact moment. His years of experience handling complex family dynamics had clearly prepared him for the scene unfolding before him. The document I've just read represents Harrison's complete last will and testament as of 6 months ago, the attorney said carefully. However, legal protocol requires me to note that deceased individuals have the right to update their final wishes up until the time of death, provided they follow proper legal procedures. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation, remembering her father's mysterious comments about arrangements and preparations. The private meeting with Mr. Fitzgerald just days before Harrison's death had been brief, but had involved the signing of documents she hadn't fully understood at the time. Without any dramatic flourish, Margaret quietly opened her modest purse and extracted a sealed envelope bearing her father's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was thick with official documents, marked with legal seals and notary stamps that indicated formal legal preparation. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice cutting through the family's growing agitation with unexpected authority. "I believe there's been an oversight in the documentation review." Every head in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. Margaret had been so quiet throughout the proceedings that most family members had forgotten her presence entirely, their attention focused exclusively on their own disappointed expectations. "Mr. Fitzgerald," Margaret continued, standing with calm dignity, "my father asked me to present this envelope to you during today's proceedings. He was very specific about the timing and circumstances of its delivery." The attorney accepted the envelope with hands that remained steady despite what Margaret suspected was considerable professional interest in its contents. His examination of the seals and signatures was thorough, his trained eye assessing the document's authenticity with the careful attention of someone who understood the enormous stakes involved. "This appears to be a properly executed codicil to the will, dated just 5 days before Harrison's death," Mr. Fitzgerald announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "The notarization and witness signatures are complete and appear authentic. Legal protocol requires that I review and incorporate any valid amendments into the estate distribution." Richard shot to his feet, his corporate composure finally cracking under the pressure of uncertainty. His voice carried the commanding tone he employed in boardroom confrontations, though it now held an unmistakable edge of panic. "This is highly irregular," Richard declared, his eyes fixed on Margaret with barely concealed suspicion. "Any legitimate legal documents would have been prepared through proper channels with appropriate family consultation and legal representation." Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her usual confidence replaced by the dawning realization that her assumptions about family inheritance might be catastrophically wrong. Her voice carried the shrill quality of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. "Margaret has been living on a teacher's salary for years," Victoria said, her tone suggesting that modest income somehow disqualified Margaret from legal standing. She couldn't possibly understand the complexities of estate planning for assets of this magnitude. "This document is clearly some form of misunderstanding or manipulation." Mr. Fitzgerald opened the sealed envelope with the careful precision of someone handling potentially explosive material. His expression remained neutral as he examined the contents, though Margaret caught a slight widening of his eyes that suggested the document's contents were significant. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading in the formal tone required for legal proceedings, his voice cutting through the family's protests with undeniable authority. The codicil's language was clear and legally binding, its implications immediately apparent to everyone present. "I, Harrison Edward Westbrook, being of sound mind and clear intention, do hereby revoke all previous distributions outlined in my will dated 6 months ago, the attorney read. After careful consideration of my children's characters and demonstrated values, I hereby bequeath my entire estate to my daughter Margaret Chin Westbrook. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard collapsed back into his chair as though physically struck, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that resembled panic. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her usual eloquence completely abandoned in the face of this stunning reversal. Uncle Charles made a choking sound that might have been protest or simple shock, while Eleanor gripped the conference table as though anchoring herself against a hurricane. Cousin Marcus looked ready to faint, his anticipated inheritance evaporating before his eyes. Mr. Fitzgerald continued reading, his voice steady despite the emotional chaos erupting around him. The codicil's language was thorough and legally precise, addressing every aspect of the estate with the careful attention of someone who had anticipated exactly this reaction. This bequest includes all business holdings, real estate properties, investment portfolios, bank accounts, and personal property not specifically mentioned in previous bequests, the attorney continued. Margaret Westbrook is hereby appointed sole executor of my estate and inherits full control of Westbrook Industries and all subsidiary companies. Margaret remained seated, her composure intact despite the magnitude of what she was hearing. The inheritance represented not just wealth but responsibility, the stewardship of a business empire her father had spent his lifetime building and protecting. Richard found his voice first, though it carried the strained quality of someone whose fundamental worldview had just been shattered. His corporate instincts engaged automatically, seeking some angle or opportunity to challenge what seemed impossible. "This is clearly the result of undue influence," Richard said, his voice rising with desperation. "Margaret spent months alone with our father during his illness. She obviously manipulated a dying man into making decisions he wasn't competent to understand." Victoria nodded frantically, grasping at any explanation that might restore her expected inheritance. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose carefully planned future had just been destroyed. "The timing is suspicious," she added. "A last-minute document change, presented by the one person who stood to benefit enormously from our father's confusion and declining mental capacity. Any reasonable court would recognize this as elder abuse." Mr. Fitzgerald raised his hand for silence, his expression carrying the authority of someone who had handled countless family disputes over substantial inheritances. His voice remained professionally neutral despite the obvious tension and accusations flying around the conference room. "I can address those concerns immediately," the attorney said. "The codicil includes detailed documentation of Harrison's mental competency at the time of signing, including independent medical and psychological evaluations. Dr. Reynolds certified that Harrison was fully capable of making binding legal decisions right up until his death." Margaret finally spoke, her voice carrying quiet strength that seemed to fill the conference room despite its soft delivery. Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent months genuinely caring for a dying parent rather than positioning for personal advantage. "My father made this decision because he observed each of your behaviors during his final months," Margaret said, her gaze moving calmly across her family's shocked faces. "He watched how you treated his illness as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. He heard your conversations about asset distribution while he was still alive and suffering." The codicil included a final paragraph that Mr. Fitzgerald read with particular emphasis, Harrison's own words explaining his decision with the clarity and moral authority that had characterized his entire business career. "To my children Richard and Victoria, and to my extended family members, I leave these modest bequests not out of spite, but out of hope that reduced circumstances might teach the values of hard work and genuine care for others that wealth has apparently failed to instill." Margaret alone demonstrated the character and compassion that I hoped to see from all my children. Security personnel appeared at the conference room door, summoned by Mr. Fitzgerald's discreet signal as the family's shock transformed into barely controlled outrage and desperate protests that echoed through the mahogany-paneled space like the death cries of entitled expectations. 3 months later, Margaret stood in her father's former office, now hers by right and responsibility, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Westbrook Industries thriving under her unexpected leadership. The shipping empire that Richard had assumed would be his was posting record profits under the guidance of someone he had dismissed as merely a schoolteacher. The transformation had been swift and decisive. Margaret's years of quietly observing her father's business practices, combined with her natural intelligence and genuine care for employees, had created a leadership style that inspired rather than intimidated. The company's senior executives, initially skeptical of the inheritance outcome, quickly recognized her competence and vision. Richard's anticipated business partnerships had evaporated overnight when potential associates learned he would not be inheriting control of the family empire. His calls went unreturned, his meetings were canceled, and his carefully cultivated relationships revealed themselves to be based entirely on his expected wealth rather than personal regard. The downtown office that Richard had already begun decorating as his future headquarters remained empty, a monument to assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. His legal challenges to the will had been dismissed by 3 separate courts, each finding the codicil to be legally binding and properly executed. Victoria's extensive renovation plans for the mansion had been quietly canceled, her deposits forfeited, and her design team redirected to other projects. The interior designers who had courted her favor now treated her calls as unwelcome interruptions, their attention focused on clients who actually possessed the resources to fund major home improvements. The country club memberships Victoria had maintained through her father's financial support became unaffordable burdens, forcing her to resign from the social positions she had considered essential to her identity. Her carefully curated lifestyle crumbled piece by piece as reality replaced expectation. Uncle Charles discovered that his anticipated role in managing international shipping contracts was simply a fantasy he had constructed around his own wishful thinking. The Singapore partners he had claimed as personal relationships proved to have loyalty only to Westbrook Industries rather than individual family members. Margaret had kept Mrs. Patterson on as head of household management, honoring the housekeeper's decades of faithful service with increased responsibilities and compensation. The mansion that Victoria had planned to modernize remained largely unchanged, its traditional elegance preserved as a tribute to Harrison's memory and taste. The shipping company's employees, from dock workers to executive assistants, expressed genuine relief at Margaret's leadership style. Unlike Richard's aggressive management philosophy, Margaret approached business relationships with the same patience and respect she had brought to her teaching career, creating an atmosphere of collaboration rather than intimidation. Margaret established a scholarship fund in her father's memory, focusing on children from working-class families who demonstrated academic potential but lacked financial resources. The program reflected her understanding that genuine success came from opportunity combined with character rather than inherited privilege. The charitable organizations that Eleanor had expected to influence through her association with Westbrook Wealth found themselves working with Margaret instead, someone who approached philanthropy as genuine service rather than social positioning. Margaret's donations were substantial but came with expectations of measurable impact and transparent accountability. Cousin Marcus's dreams of operational oversight evaporated as quickly as they had formed, his enthusiastic but incompetent approach to business management clearly unsuited for the complexities of international shipping. His collection of first-edition books, while valuable, provided little comfort against the reality of his ordinary middle-class existence. The mansion's staff, from groundskeepers to security personnel, thrived under Margaret's leadership. She treated them as valued team members rather than invisible servants, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect that had been missing during the family's anticipatory period of inheritance planning. Margaret's first board meeting had been tense, with several members clearly expecting her to defer to more experienced executives or seek male guidance in managing the company. Instead, they encountered someone who had absorbed her father's business wisdom through years of quiet observation and possessed the confidence to make decisive leadership choices. The quarterly financial reports exceeded all projections, reflecting not just market conditions but the positive impact of Margaret's employee-focused management style. Worker productivity increased, customer satisfaction improved, and the company's reputation in international shipping circles was enhanced rather than diminished by the leadership transition. Richard attempted one final approach to Margaret, arriving at the mansion with a proposal for shared management responsibilities that would allow him to save face while acknowledging the inheritance outcome. Margaret listened politely before declining with the same quiet firmness she had employed in managing difficult students and parents. Victoria made her own desperate appeal, suggesting that family harmony required some accommodation of her social and financial needs. Margaret's response was compassionate but absolute, offering emotional support while maintaining the boundaries established by their father's final wishes. The legal challenges finally ended when Richard and Victoria's attorneys advised them that continued litigation would only result in mounting legal fees without any reasonable chance of success. The codicil was ironclad, Harrison's competency was well documented, and Margaret's inheritance was legally unassailable. On the anniversary of Harrison's death, Margaret stood in the mansion's garden where her father had spent countless peaceful hours planning and cultivating beauty. The roses he had planted decades earlier bloomed with the same vibrant colors that had brought him joy, their continued growth a living testament to his vision and care. The shipping empire continued to thrive under her stewardship, its success measured not just in financial terms, but in the loyalty and respect of employees who appreciated working for someone who valued their contributions and treated them with dignity. Margaret had transformed from the overlooked daughter into the respected leader of a business dynasty, her father's faith in her character vindicated by every decision she made and every relationship she built. The family members who had dismissed her discovered that genuine worth was measured by actions rather than assumptions, and that Harrison Westbrook's final gift to his favorite daughter was not just wealth, but the opportunity to demonstrate the values he had hoped to instill in all his children. Have you ever witnessed a situation where the quiet, underestimated person turned out to be the most capable leader? What do you think makes someone truly deserving of responsibility and respect? Share your thoughts in the comments below about times when actions spoke louder than expectations. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice prevailing over greed.